information about trauma to start. Kind of give us, lay some groundwork around that. So the word trauma is being used quite a bit in popular parlance. You kind of hear it in different places that maybe we weren't hearing the word used so much before the pandemic, right? So we're hearing the word trauma a lot more since the pandemic. And I just guess want to clarify a couple of things based on my experience working from a trauma-informed perspective as a family therapist. So when we talk about trauma, every person is going to understand and experience from their own unique perspective, right? So we can say, well, there was this terrible hurricane. I'm in South Florida, by the way. And, it hit a particular area and there was destruction of property. Some people lost homes, some people lost livelihood. And that we can look at it from the outside and say, oh my gosh, that's a traumatic experience, right? But then you can interact with 10 different people who were in that area, and each one of them are going to understand the experience of that hurricane in their own unique way. So as a therapist, I am not deciding if a person's experience was traumatic. So that's kind of where I want to start, right? So a traumatic experience is one in which a person feels unsafe and doesn't know how to get safe. So let's just use that as sort of a global understanding of trauma, right? And it isn't the event that is the trauma, it's their response to it. Okay? So let's just look at that for a minute. An experience can happen once, it can be prolonged, it can be repetitive. If the person felt that they were not safe and they could not get safe. And then their method of coping with it is what we're looking at when we talk about a person's experience, right? So how are they making sense of it? How are they talking about it? And how are they coping with it? Okay. So when we're talking about working with a family system, because that's what today is about, we want to pay attention to a few factors, right? So let's just kind of throw out some questions you would maybe ask yourself as you're beginning to assess when you're working with a family that is coming in because they've experienced a traumatic event. They are identifying it that way. And they're coming for therapy, right? So a couple of things that you want to sort of assess from the front end. How was the family functioning before the traumatic event? You want to get a sense of how were they functioning previous to the traumatic event. You want to get a sense of where they are in their family life cycle development, right? So many of you have studied, there are stages, or at least that's how we kind of make sense of a family system moving through the ever progressing and change and evolving structure that is the family, right? People are growing, they're developing, they're changing. So where are they when they've experienced this traumatic event in terms of their development as a family? So have they been able to function pretty effectively? Have they been moving through the progression or the changes in the stages of development as a family and individually, right? Have they been able to adjust roles and have some flexibility and manage change? And then what strengths and resiliency factors do the members of the family as a whole bring to the therapy process? So what hard things have they been through already? How did they cope? How did they manage it? And then here's Obviously one that we focus on as therapists, right? What risk factors or barriers to the healing process are they facing? And one of the big ones that I see in my work with families who've experienced trauma is intergenerational trauma, right? Like that's one of the big risk factors that typically a family coming into therapy because they've experienced a trauma and they're really struggling to cope. They have, and I'm going to generalize here, a history of family trauma in some form, right? That is getting in the way of their ability to adapt and manage the trauma, heal from it. So let's talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma. Anybody want to throw out what in the world does that mean? Is it even a thing? How do you understand it? There's some debate about it, but who has some thoughts about that? Trista, go ahead.
Hey, I'm glad to be doing this. Sorry, I'm driving. Don't worry, my eyes are on the road. I just finished an EMDR training, and it was really interesting. She made a point that there's research that's showing that trauma from generations before, so specifically first and second generations before, is passed down genetically, right? And so that she didn't cite the research study, but I found it fascinating that yes, there's tons of information on it, but they're solidifying it to the point that they're talking about for sure what's happened for the generation before, and the generation before that is in your genes, right? So my understanding of it, that was an interesting specific, is that trauma that happens, say, even to my dad, is something that can manifest in my own mental health symptoms. And then where I've learned about it in our program, specifically with oppressional trauma, is say African Americans, for instance, and people who identify as Black or are Black ethnicity, right? And that the trauma from slavery and all of that can also be passed down. So these things that happen to large groups of people, these things that happen to family, that can be in the genes and manifest as a lot of different things. My understanding is certainly mental health symptoms, and a lot of diagnoses that are given are from either trauma or intergenerational trauma. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Trista. So yes, when we talk about intergenerational trauma, and now we're able to identify, not me, but scientists who study genetics are able to understand that there is an epigenetic factor, right? So it isn't that intergenerational trauma changes our DNA or a traumatic experience like slavery or living through the Depression or a pandemic changes our DNA, but it can have an epigenetic adjustment, right? Which means the parts of our genes that help us regulate stress maybe don't turn on or are affected in terms of their on-off switch. That's sort of a very simplified way of putting it, right? But that's an important piece. So there's two ways that we're understanding that intergenerational trauma can affect family systems, right? One is the epigenetic piece, which affects how people manage overwhelming emotion, whether it's sadness or anger or fear. And then the piece about how when a parent who is a descendant of a survivor of Auschwitz, who was epigenetically affected, struggles with regulating their own emotions, now the way they're parenting their child is going to affect their child's methods of coping, sense of attachment, sense of security, sense of bonding, right? So then now we've got the second piece. So there's the epigenetic piece, but there's also the relational behavioral piece, right? There's a learned response to anxious anxiety, right? So if a parent really struggles with managing their anxiety because of the epigenetic piece, then the child will respond to the parent's way of coping with anxiety with their own maybe struggle, right? Like it'll be harder for them to learn how we cope with anxiety. And that's just an example. So maybe now they are going to struggle also, right? So why is that important? Why are we paying attention to this? We have a family coming to see us because they experienced a traumatic event. And we're asking these questions. How did they function before? What are their strengths and resiliency factors? And then what are the barriers to healing, growth, and change? Which one of them is this intergenerational transmission of trauma. So useful for us to know. However, also really useful for our clients to know. Because if you're already working with families or even individuals who are trying to manage trauma triggers and they don't understand what's happening to them, which is terrifying in and of itself, right? So, you know, how come I'm working with a family right now who have family in Israel, Jewish family, survivors of the Holocaust in their family, direct descendants, and recently, where I live here in our community, their synagogue was attacked in a very violent way. And they're coming in with a lot of symptoms, a lot of anxiety, sleeplessness, physical symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, and they're glued to the television, watching news every day about what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And they don't understand why the experience of sitting and watching the news is giving them heart palpitations, making them nauseous, giving them headaches, right? And then making them bicker with each other and really struggle in their interactions with each other, making them short-tempered with their children and with each other as partners. So when we as clinicians can give information about how intergenerational trauma can affect them in their daily living, then it helps them make sense of their own experiences and helps them understand what's happening. And hopefully helps them create space where they're turning off the news. Sometimes that simple change can make such a big difference in how they're coping in their daily lives. So we having that awareness is really helpful. I'm sorry, I have a lemon seed in my mouth. Okay, Trista, you had more to say or something? Your hand was still up.
No, I have a question if it's
Okay.
an appropriate time.
Yep, go ahead.
I was wondering, oh, go ahead.
No, you're good.
I was wondering, how would you explain that to him? Like, because I understand it. Oh, am I breaking up?
Nope, I can hear you.
I'll type it in the chat or ask it at a different point. But if you can hear me now, how would you explain that to them? Yeah. What would you say to explain that to the family with being Jewish? I just had a client come in my other business besides therapy who is Jewish and was talking about that being in the genes. And I was just wondering, how would you explain that to the family in a way that would be not only culturally sensitive, but sensitive to the symptoms they're feeling right now and something that helps them understand how what they may have been viewing, even starting from their life before this event, may have been from an anxious lens, like addressing that narrative that they have with narrative therapy. Like, how would you explain that all?
It's a great question. So I use a narrative approach. That's the model that's sort of my theoretical foundation, right? And I definitely incorporate neurobiology into the work that I'm doing because the reason we understand as much as we do about how trauma influences a person's regulation, right? Self-regulation, emotional reactivity, has a lot to do with our ability now to study live brains, right? Neurobiology. What is happening inside our brains and our chemistry, the release of different chemicals, different parts of our brains lighting up when we are triggered. So one of the ways I explain that, Trista, is from a neurobiological perspective. Like, this is how humans are made. And we can talk about it from sort of a fight, flight, or freeze perspective. You know, we as humans have evolved to stay alive, right? And the way we've done that over time has to do with the way we react to threatening situations, right? So we develop ways of coping with threatening situations that allow us to survive, whether that's fleeing, freezing, playing dead, fighting, right? And then there's some new ways that people are thinking about it based on brain research too, like, let me make you feel really special, like the oppressor, you know, let me try to please you, right? So that's another method of coping. But the way I'm explaining it is going to be very much informed, Trista, by what brings them to therapy, right? What do they want to achieve? What are they hoping to focus on in the therapy process? Because that's where they're most motivated. That's where they're most invested in creating change. And I don't want to flood people with information they're not looking for, right? So I will always ask, what do you understand about what's happening inside your body when you are triggered? And then I will say, would you like more information about what's happening? And then I will share, and I will give resources, and I will recommend books and websites and, you know, apps, depending on what would fit their needs, right? But so I would start by them, not necessarily their ancestors. I would start by the person or the family members, helping them understand some key concepts. One of which is what happens to our brain when we are triggered and we are not able to regulate. And what happens, I don't know if any of you are aware of this, if you took I think it's in the Working with Child and Adolescent class, where you learn about interpersonal neurobiology, where you got to learn about the hand model and the head, the prefrontal cortex flipping. Yeah, I don't know if you remember that. Anyway, so that's a really simple way of understanding what happens when people get triggered related to trauma or fear, right? Feeling threatened in some way, is our wise mind, that's how I talk about it, our executive functioning, the part of our brain that is in charge of executive functioning, goes offline. It flips up. And our impulsive mind takes over. So that, again, is a survival mechanism. And so much of this piece, Trista and everybody, is helping remove the shame, the stigma, the guilt, the blame for the way people are coping when they get triggered, right? Like, you help people understand in a sort of universal way, well, here's what happens to everybody. Your brain goes offline. Now, what is required to get your brain back online so that you can go back to using your wise mind, your executive functioning, regulate your reactions, right? Think before you speak, is pretty simple, but very hard to do. The first thing you have to do is get oxygen back to your brain. Because what happens to our breathing when we are fearful or angry or sad, devastated? We start to breathe really shallow. maybe muscles tense, both of which block the oxygen flow to our brain. So we're getting some, but we're not getting enough, right? Yes, classic. Yeah. So even if you can have what I call the half second, the hair breadth space between your emotion, that intense emotion, and how you react, just long enough to take one deep breath, you can begin to get your wise mind back online. So all of that is really focused on each individual person's experience when they are triggered, right? So I'm not yet talking about like intertransmission of trauma, generational trauma, intergenerational transmission of trauma. However, I will do a genogram, and that's where I will explore intergenerational transmission of trauma. So now the person individually better understands, or the family, the group that's sitting in my office. In this case, for the example I gave you, it was a couple with a teenager. This family that I'm seeing right now who are Jewish, who have family in Israel. So it's a couple and their teenager. And I'm helping them each individually understand what's happening when they're getting so reactive, when they're flooded with these emotions. For them, it's the family was teetering between rage, like feeling enraged all the time, and deep sadness, helplessness, hopelessness. So I'm helping them understand in the room together, they are together, understanding themselves and each other better. So they can shift from a perspective of blaming, shaming, feeling guilty, to more compassion for themselves, for each other, right? Then we do the genogram and we look at how, their family history has many instances of traumatic experiences. And this moves to helping make sense of behaviors within context, right? So maybe the fact that this is a heterosexual couple, the woman's parents never talked about the Holocaust, refused to talk about anything that had to do with religious persecution, the Holocaust, would completely shut down if the topic got brought up when she would ask her parents. Her partner, her husband, had parents who talked about it all the time, to the point where it would be overwhelming. Like he could not think about life other than the trauma that his people experienced. So in both those situations, the way their families were oriented around this terrible atrocity that happened in their family and the ongoing persecution they experienced, informed how they were responding to each other, right? And also how they were responding to their teenager. Making sense of behaviors within context. That's the foundation of what we do as family therapists, right? Like that's the big shift for us in terms of systemic relational thinking. That's how we define ourselves. We are focused on making sense of behaviors within context. Well, the neurobiology gave us so much information to help us make sense of behaviors within context, especially around traumatic experiences and reactions to those experiences. Yeah. Okay. So I want to definitely save time for questions, but let me just put the narrative piece in there. Two things. One is why work with the whole family? So from my perspective, as I just said, healing happens and the research backs us up, it's not just the world according to Dr. Dawn, healing happens quicker from trauma through relationship. Healing happens quicker through relationship. Okay, because when we can interact with each other in a space that allows us to attend to and soothe ourselves or support each other, soothing each other when we're triggered, it rewires our brain. It literally rewires our brain. That ability to have eye contact, to be in a space with another human being where our hearts are in unison, we're taking deep breaths together. It literally rewires our brain, which helps create that space when we're triggered to take the deep breaths so we can regulate our emotional reactivity, right? It rewires our brain so we can regulate our emotions. Okay, so that's why we work with the whole family, not individuals. I feel strongly about this. So many people still want us, they're like, well, they won't really be able to be themselves or tell you what's really going on if their family members are there. You won't really be able to connect with them if their family members are there. They're going to feel like they can't truly let you know what's going on. And I say, if you are doing your job, if you are validating and normalizing their experiences, if you are showing compassion for everything that they're saying, everything that's happening, if they feel absent, you're completely absent of judgment, they will engage with you and with each other in a way that will allow you to see what's happening between them so that you can be the most effective therapist for them. Okay, so now the narrative piece. Why narrative therapy? Narrative therapy, I feel like is a really good fit with working with trauma recovery and healing because the foundational theoretical underpinnings really focus on social justice. That's what calls me to the model, right? Initially, that's what really called me to the model. Social justice. So much of the experiences people have that exacerbate their ability to recover from trauma have to do with social injustices, right? Racism, sexism, ageism, abilityism, socioeconomic ism, all the isms, right? So narrative therapy is really focused on what are the stories, the dominant stories around you in the larger Western world culture or wherever your culture is embedded that are influencing your understanding of your value and worth. Because that's going to make a difference in the narrative you're creating, in the story you're creating, in the meaning you're holding about this traumatic experience. So that's one piece. Another piece is that narrative therapy emphasizes each individual's understanding and meaning and privileges the creation of stories that are alternatives to those dominant discourses, right? Giving clients an opportunity, especially families, together to create narratives around the traumatic experience that are based on their own voices, their own needs, their own strengths, resiliency, gives them the opportunity to take ownership in a way that you can unite them to maybe take a stand against these larger dominant discourses or narratives that are causing them to question their own value and worth. Narrative therapy creates opportunities for people to develop new relationships, different relationships with the traumatic experience by the process of externalization, right? The person is not the problem is the problem. By coming together to figure out what unique outcomes they would prefer. So what's happening when the problem takes a day off? And for me, one of the most powerful pieces is many times, because I work a lot with adult survivors of childhood sexual trauma and their families, many times the experiences people have had that were traumatic for them are unspeakable. They're some of the most terrible, atrocious, unspeakable things that human beings have endured and human beings have perpetrated. Being able to put these unspeakable events into words, into a narrative, into a beginning, middle, and end, just the flow of narrative and the way we talk about narrative and story, right? When they are able to tell their story, put words to the unspeakable, they reclaim their story for themselves. Which helps shift from being a victim to a survivor, right? Which is such a big part of the healing process. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna stop there and take questions. Good? Yeah, okay.
So I know you can't see my name, but I'm Susie. And I have a question about where we were at. The first step you were kind of saying was to take like the shame out of the trauma and to, parts of othering it and making their responses make sense in context of what's happening, in context of the trauma. So once you've done that, and once they've kind of owned that their responses are um, understandable. If not healthy, at least it's understandable, and they now have ownership over their own physical and emotional responses. How do you keep that from becoming a new problem? I'm thinking of my clients who have panic attacks, frequent panic attacks, and their avoidant behavior has now become a little bit of a crutch. Oh, I'm having a day. Oh, yes, we're now acknowledging we're having a panic attack, but how do we keep that from becoming its own problem?
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding it. It sounds like what you're saying is having the knowledge of what's happening doesn't lead to changing what's happening. Yes. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So in the case of frequent panic attacks, and I'm saying like maybe one a day, multiple times a week, when we first started, they were afraid of them. They were scared of them. They didn't understand what was
Got
happening.
it. Okay.
And it was scaring everyone around them, but it was unavoidable. Now that we understand what's happening, it's almost like they're leaning into it.
Mm-hmm.
They're appreciating their panic attacks because we've understood that these are serving a purpose. It's a protective feature, and we can acknowledge that it is protecting them from whatever harm they're afraid of. And it's a struggle to move past that to wanting to change out of daily panic attacks.
Got it. Okay. Well, I mean, I would answer that the way I would answer any question about clients who are not ready for change, right? Like readiness for change is such an important piece of the process of therapy. So we're always assessing for that. In what area are they ready for change? And by ready, it's not a pathologizing, right? Like literally have the emotional resources to make the change, have the wherewithal, have the readiness, right? So for sure, in my work with families that are managing that shift from, having no idea what's happening to now having some sense of what's happening, there's times where they can kind of plateau, right? Like they've used up all of their resources to show up, talk about the experience, begin to better understand the experience, and begin to show some compassion and support for each other. And now they need a break. And they need to rest before they take on the next level of change, right? So really, I would give it back to the client, and I would ask the client, you know, I make observations all the time in my sessions. Here's what I'm seeing. Is this accurate, you know, to your experience? And where are you with this? Right? So now you understand the panic attacks. They're happening daily. You're almost wearing them like a protective cloak, and you're finding them valuable. Is this, you know, a place that you feel safe and comfortable staying for a while? And, you know, check in with their family. What's everybody else observing? How is this for everyone else? Maybe now I shift from supporting this person who's wearing the cloak of panic attacks to helping the family members with their reactions to the panic attacks. Right? Does that help?
And I think a lot of the pressure to move past that plateau is coming from the family members and their reactions.
Sure. Well, and so, I mean, how many times are we going to be affirming our family members in sessions that everybody's going to respond to trauma differently? Repeatedly. I mean, I probably say it in every session. You each have your own unique experience. And really, my job is to support each of you finding ways to be with each other and accept that you're having different experiences, that it's okay, right? So maybe the person who's wearing the cloak of panic attacks, that whole process is somehow triggering to the other family members. Well, what's that about? What's going on for them? What are they afraid of? You know, if it's a mom, maybe the kids are like, oh, we're never getting her back, or I'm walking on eggshells, or right? Okay. So being able to help them all talk about that in the room together is really helpful. It's really helpful, right? So is there a way both things can be happening simultaneously? The panic attack is happening, the child is needing reassurance, maybe. How can there be both? How can there be a panic attack that is also creating some reassurance? Does that help? Yeah, okay. Trista, your hand is up. And everybody else, don't be shy. Raise your hands. Trista, go ahead.
Hey, I pulled over so you won't lose me this time. I was wondering, I had two questions. The first one, when you were talking about, you know, trauma, there was a phrase in one of my trainings about, you know, trauma happens in relationship, it's healed in relationship, and working with families. And that'll be more of my next internship was with families. But I have a particular case where the child isn't placed in his permanent home, and he does have he's struggling with complex PTSD. He's 10. And so I'm like, do I bring his parents in that are currently fostering him? Technically DCFS is his guardian right now, and there's recent trauma that just happened, trauma from 3 years ago, like if we're talking about specific events. And then of course there's the intergenerational fact. And so I'm wondering if I only have one more month weekly, and I've talked a little bit about with the foster mom, because they're surprised that now he's acting out. And I was like, oh, it's because we're starting to work with some of the stuff that's coming up. And he's, you know, he's a little boy, unlike their adopted daughter that acts much differently. And so, you know, I'm seeing them respond with discipline and, oh no, you shouldn't act that way. And why are you all of a sudden acting out? Why can't you be better? And I'm just like, oh. So I explained a little bit about, you know, brain memories being deleted differently, what we're working on. But I'd love some ideas about bringing in the family. I mean, you were so passionate about that. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And then I have one other question, which is, how do you deal with pre-verbal trauma, where perhaps it's not coming out in words, but it's not coming out in images. It's different storage of memory in the brain, and how narrative would approach that, if that's an option to for you to answer.
Okay, I'll go to the first one first. So I would say talk to the child about their comfort level having one or both adults, parenting adults in the room as the therapy, as part of the therapy process. I definitely recommend having at least one, if not both, if possible. Because what the research shows is, even if this child gets to interact with one adult that feels safe to them in a way that gives them, you know, again, sort of some of those reinforcements around getting the executive functioning or the wise brain back online. When they're young, I talk about your upstairs and your downstairs brain. So, but like the way I would approach it is, you know, maybe just have one of the adults. It can be overwhelming to have both, maybe. So I might just say, who do you prefer? Okay, we're gonna have that one. And then do more of a psychoed session where you're talking about like the upstairs brain, the downstairs brain, and when your brain flips the lid, make it clear that this happens to all kids, right? It's not just him. But also, are there times that the parent, when they see the child flip their lid or the upstairs brain goes offline, that the parent also flips? And it happens all the time. So if the parent or the caretaker can become vulnerable in that conversation, so you might have a prep conversation ahead of time, which I often do. If they can be vulnerable in that conversation and say, you know what, sometimes I also get so mad that I find I've said words that afterwards I'm like, ew, I wish I didn't say that. I want to take it back, put it back in my mouth, right? So if you can give them an opportunity to talk about what that experience is like for each one of them when he acts out, or she, whoever this child is. And then what it's like for the parent. When you act out, I get worried because I don't want you to get in trouble. Or when you act out, I'm so scared for you because I understand that you've had so many challenges in life. And sometimes when we act out, we get ourselves in more trouble, or we have more challenges in life, and that makes it even harder. You know what I mean? Like, if the adult person can say, here's what's happening for me, and then together come up with a plan to help both of them get their executive functioning back online, right? So then you teach grounding techniques. What about box breathing? Let's do some box breathing together. What works for grounding techniques for you when you're doing this, parent, adult? What works for you, right? So I ask, what works for you, parent, adult? What works for you? Do you know what works for you, young person? Can we try some things together and see what might be most effective, right? Even if this child can only gets to have one interaction with one adult like that, it's going to make a difference. Does that help? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Sure. The pre-verbal one, I would need a lot more information to dive into that with you, Trista. I mean, in general, I would say you want to focus on two things when clients come into your office. One, what do they want to get out of therapy? What are their goals? That should be the thing that guides everything, right? And then obviously your model, your theoretical underpinning. So those two things got everything. So whether a traumatic experience was pre-verbal or not, what the person wants different in their life now is what we're going to pay attention to. And how that healing process happens can happen no matter when the trauma occurred, right? Because the brain wiring stuff the neurobiology and the interpersonal neurobiology piece of it is just as effective in healing no matter when the trauma occurred. So yes, maybe they can't do the narrative piece where they put the beginning, middle, and end, where they put words to the unspeakable. Maybe that piece won't happen, other than something really terrible happened to me. It should not have happened to me. The people who did it to me should not have done it to me. And now I'm taking my life back. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you.
Okay, there's so many comments in the chat, and I just need to tell you, I don't read chats. I'm terrible at the chats because I can't do both. Obviously, you see I'm pretty excited and passionate about this, but there's no way I'm going to read all these chats. So can somebody tell me if there's questions in there that it would be helpful for me to answer?
We're kind of discussing and talking in the chat. I don't see any questions for
Okay.
you specifically.
Okay.
I would say there's the one I answered, but I'd like to hear Dr. Dawn's take on it. So if you suspect there's intergenerational trauma, but unknown facts like cases where people are adopted or in foster care or too young to remember, how do you deal with that possibility, but you don't have any facts or any memories to draw on?
Yeah. Well, so then you go to, that's kind of similar to what I just said. Like you go to what brings them to therapy, right? Like what is their goal? What do they want to achieve? And how is not knowing a piece of the trauma, right? Like for many people, it's the unknowns that they're having the traumatic response to. It's the unknowns that are making it so challenging for them. So being able to talk about that, right? Like make that part of reclaiming the narrative. How does not knowing your family history, the things that happened that put you into child protective services that you don't even know about, but now you're adopted, but you know bad things happened. How is that affecting your sense of who you are? And what stories out there are you hearing from other people, right? Or the dominant discourses. So maybe the dominant discourse is you need to know your history, your family history in order to heal. Well, that is an incorrect dominant discourse, right? So then they would be challenging that and creating a new narrative, right? Who I am now is way more important than any missing information. What I do now with who I am in my relationships, what actions I can take, what stands I can take. One of the things about narrative that I value greatly is when families move to a place of recognizing the injustices and taking a stand against the dominant discourses, they often move into a place of action, right? Like activism, empowerment, which is so overused, but I'm going to say it anyway. So I don't know, Annalyn, how did you answer that, Dr. Schooley?
I went a slightly different direction in terms of if someone is responding to an event and experiencing it as, they're responding to an event, but the intensity of the event response is bigger than the event would typically warrant, spilling the milk, and they bounce off the walls, that we as therapists can suspect that there's probably some of this other trauma back there in the history of the person or transgenerationally that better accounts for, so that we, again, non-pathologize, that we look at the big reaction that everybody else is saying, that's pathology to react that big, to say, no, I'll bet you there's context. I bet there's more to know that we may never get to know, but I bet there's more to know that would explain this. So
Sure.
I guess it also, now that I said that out loud, it pulls back to the concept that everything makes sense in context, but we don't always know the context.
Yes, sometimes we can't know the context, but we can rest in the fact that even if we don't know it, we can still change.
Yes,
Right?
and they're not at fault. That doesn't make them crazy or sick or wrong or bad or, yeah.
I mean, great example. So in that example, what I would do is, again, it goes back to what did the clients want? I would ask the person spilling the milk, would you like this to be different? You know what I mean? Like, I hear people in your lives saying they're not thrilled with the way you're reacting to this spilled milk, but I'm curious about what it's like for you. You know, what's going on inside of you when that milk is spilled? And are you wanting that to be different? Because I can give you,
Or if we're talking about a 5-year-old, how can the parent
yes,
react to it differently?
right. Well, both though, right? Both.
Sure.
Like if I start with the 5-year-old, but the parent's observing me interact, I'm modeling, right? For the parents, like, wow, that sounds really frustrating and it's scary. And you're worried that when you spill the milk, somebody's going to get mad at you. And you really don't like it when people get mad at you. Oh my gosh. So what would help if mommy doesn't get mad at me? I always pick on the mommies. Okay, mommy, what's happening for you when the milk is spilled? What's going on for you, right? Let me know about it. Yeah. And maybe mommy has her own trauma triggers happening right there. I mean, I cannot tell you how many people who experience trauma in childhood struggle with messes of any kind. Their environment safety is so important to their emotional and mental well-being, but they don't know, they don't understand. And the people around them are like, I mean, I can't, they walk in the room and they move the magazines. What is going on? Right? So again, it's about helping make sense of behaviors within context.
Had her hand up for a while. Michelle, what's your question?
Hi, Dr. Shelton. Just a quick question. So I know we spoke earlier about, meeting our clients where they are and trying to assess their motivation. So how would you engage with a family who's there to discuss, some traumatic events, but the level of motivation varies from member to member? Like you have some members that want to resolve it, you have some that want to sweep it under the rug. Like, where do you go to help that family find cohesion?
It's such a great question. And it's, sort of the quintessential family therapy question, right? Because never, ever have I had a family walk into therapy where everybody was on the same page.
Right.
Never, right? So how do we work with that? And I think that's one of the main reasons a lot of people just see individuals, because they're like, this is the hardest part of family therapy. And for me, most rewarding. Like I take it as a personal challenge. You can see from Dr. Schooley's comments about me, like, I'm just like, I'm gonna figure this out. I am gonna figure this out. So I really think it is about mastering the art of being multi-partial. What does that mean? It means you join with, validate, and normalize each person's experience in the room. You're multi-partial, right? You're partial to each, knowing, because I'm from a narrative perspective, social constructionist perspective, each person's experience is real for them. So as soon as I get out of this seat that they try to put me into, which is be the judge or determine who's right or be the referee, I just take all of those, they try to hand it to me and I just gently say, oh, interesting, I'm going to put that over here. I'm not a referee, but thanks for offering me the whistle. Oh, you're giving me the judge gavel. Thank you, but I'm not a judge. I'm going to put that over here, right? Like I just have, you gently keep reiterating, what I'm here to do is help you as a family do your relationships in a way that is more satisfying to all of you. That's what I'm here for. And then really try to deeply listen to and understand each person's experience and perspective. And you do that in front of each other, right? So they get to hear how I normalize and validate each person. It's not if you're right, that means you're wrong. So being in different places about healing from trauma, from traumatic experiences is what happens. And I validate and normalize that. You will
it
feel
can-
different levels of motivation, right? You will feel different levels of readiness. Yeah? Okay.
I was going to say, and being on different pages might mean they're in the same book. So over time, the more we are able to validate and empathize with each member of the family, we start to find out what is common across this. So maybe everybody is up for trust, but they're very different about what that trust looks like. Or everybody's up for, this being better in the family in some way, but the route to it is quite different, or the reason it's not that way could be quite different. But that's what MRI teaches, is to go slow in order to be brief. And sometimes it takes a long time to get to know everybody's perspective and really join with each of them before you can start to see how the dots connect.